I'm just going to give you some tips here. The first thing I wanted to do is just give you a little tidbit that Rebecca said, you know, they grew in Peru and in South America. So for a very long time, more than 2,000 years ago, peppers were extensively grown in Central and South America, in Mexico, and also in the West Indies. So so in fact, we could attribute the spread to Europe from Columbus and other early explorers who introduced peppers to Europe. And then it was introduced into many of the European cuisines. And then the Europeans then spread it and introduced peppers throughout the world into Asia, which I thought interesting. I thought Asia had peppers a long time ago, and maybe Rebecca knows the answer to that. But according to the information I looked at, the Europeans actually introduced peppers into Africa and Asia. And then, so by that happened in around the 17th century. But interestingly, peppers that were introduced into North America by the colonists that came, that arrived in the 1600s, 1700s. So it came back, even though it's from the Americas, it's not North American, and it likes warmer weather. So peppers to come to North America took a very circuitous route. It was, you know, so I thought that was an interesting tidbit. So the rationale, I mean, obviously you can go to a nursery or Lowe's, the big box stores or whatever, and you can buy pepper plants that have already been started. But the rationales for starting your own plants, you have to do it indoors because peppers have a long growing season and they grow slowly during cool periods. So it would take a really long time in our neck of the woods. Further south, you could possibly grow them outside from the very beginning. But because of our area, I'd say the 6, 7, and north, you need to start them indoors because the growing season is just too long. So sweet peppers tend to mature a bit faster, and the hot peppers take longer. Of course, it depends on the growing conditions and how warm it is, but that's sort of a rule of thumb. So one of the reasons you want to plant your own seeds is that it allows you control over the timing, like when you plant it. You can decide yourself, I'm going to start them in January, I'm going to start them in February, I'm going to do this. So there's more control than just going to the nursery and picking out a certain size plant. The other thing, it provides you a bigger selection, as Rebecca talked about, all the different sources. So you could try all different kinds of variety, because my understanding is, and actually I haven't thought about it before, but I think these nurseries and where we go to buy our plants around here, they just have a few different kinds of varieties. You wouldn't find as many varieties if you grew your own. So that's another reason. And it also assures that you know how they germinated. So you know things weren't added to them like growth hormones or chemicals. So it gives you that peace of mind. So the other thing, which I mean, I don't know, I haven't grown peppers from seeds, but the number of days to maturity that's on your seed packets, that actually refers to the days after you transplant them outside. It doesn't mean starting them from seed. And it may say that on there. I don't know, it may say, you know, okay, from seed, this is how long, but generally my understanding is that it's from the time you transplanted them outside. So your pepper seeds must be planted indoors. And I found some articles I looked at said 6 to 8 weeks before, some said 8 to 10. So this is sort of a sliding scale there. So in that window, so if you want peppers this summer, you probably should start them now. In this month, you shouldn't wait. And so you need that much time before transplanting them outside. And you also, so you have to think about that, but you also want to make sure that you plant them outside 2 to 3 weeks after the last frost. So those are two things you have to think about. So it's not just one or the other. So you think about starting them, giving them enough time but you also need to look at the frost, last frost in our area, which is 7 here, or somebody said they were in 6A. And you want to make sure you don't put them outside to transplant them in the ground unless it's much warmer. But obviously you have to play it by ear. But this is the rule of thumb. And pepper seeds are slow to germinate. They can take sometimes 1 week, but sometimes it can be up to a month, depending on what you plant. And of course, you can speed that up by growing them indoors and increasing the heat and the light. Okay, so I'm sorry that Shirley had put this on 2 slides, so the font was bigger, so I apologize for it being smaller. So basically, if you're going to grow your own, this is what you should do. So Rebecca gave you lots of interesting varieties and where you can go, and go to the local garden center where your choice will probably be very narrow, and just the generally common ones, popular ones that people like will probably be sold there. You can go online, or interesting, I hadn't thought about this. If you find a pepper you really like at the grocery store that you've eaten, or you bought it at the farmer's market, you could apparently just scrape it out and scrape the seeds out and give it a try. Now, I'm not covering what you have to do with that, whether you have to, dry it or whatever, but it is something you could do. You could try your own little experiment. You get better germination, I've read, if you soak them in warm water overnight. You don't have to do that. They will germinate, but most of the things I read said that they germinate better if you do that. So you want to plant your seeds in pots or containers. And apparently there's some new things, something called Jiffy peat pots that you can buy. They look like little medallions, and they come in a box. You get a lot of them. And you put them in water, warm water, and they become like a pot, a little pot. And things I've read said that people have very good luck with germination using them. The soil's already right there, and then you just rip some of the outside coating, which I haven't seen any myself, but I think they're like a little plastic. So that is a problem. Eventually you'll have to throw that away at some point, but you rip the top off and you stick your finger in there and put your seeds in. And there's other kinds of degradable peat pots that we've all seen at the stores. And you can use plastic pots or trays with holes in the bottom to also put your seeds. And you want to have a separate tray, whether you use pots or just another tray. You want to put that inside a tray because that's the best way to water it, rather than pouring water on top of it. You'll have these little pots, and if you pour too much water, you could splash things out. It's just better to set them in water for maybe 10 minutes and then pour the excess water off. I also read you can mist them if you want to, but then you're making the leaves wet, and that could, invite maybe fungus or other things. So, and many of these pots, you have a sort of like a dome or a plastic part. Sometimes I have one of these, a little plastic, like 72 thing, little pots, and it has a plastic dome and it helps keep it moist. So you want to watch for that. You don't want to encourage any mold or fungi. So you fill your pots and your trays, and almost everybody suggests you can make your own, but you can buy this seed starting soil. And interestingly, it's not really soil. It's sphagnum peat moss, vermiculite, and perlite. So there's no soil, there's no actual soil like potting soil in it, and there's no nutrients in it to speak of. And you tamp that down, and then you put more on top of it. Not hard, you shouldn't tamp it down real hard, but tamp it down a little, and then put some more. And then you basically sort of lay the seeds, you put them in, but you don't put them way far down in, maybe 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch. and you could squeeze it with your finger and just get the soil to cover it. You want it to be very light because this starting soil is very sort of light and fluffy, if you will, and it provides a lot of aeration, and it's good for the roots. So anyway, I covered about pouring the water into the tray. You can let it set for about 10 minutes. That should soak it up in your pots, and then you pour the excess water out. Now, the seeds need a temperature of about 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate. So there's suggestions of actually using a warming mat. You can buy those online. Looks like a heating pad or something, but flatter and not as puffy maybe. And that's a good idea to do that. And that will help, it'll help them germinate faster, and it's better for them. So this allows the dormancy to be broken in the seeds and to get started. So you can place your containers on by a south-facing window, but it's actually better to use grow lights if you have them, and they're not really expensive to buy them. You can have fluorescent ones, you can go online and look, and regular ones. So there's all kinds of information online as to what lumens and watts, and I forget now, there's another a unit that you look at too, but there's a lot of information about that. And some of you may already have experience with working with grow lights. And the idea is that it allows the plants that you're growing after they germinate to be sturdier, because if you grow them in a window, they tend to get leggier. They grow towards the window, and you don't really want them to get leggy. So you're better off, if you're going to do this, to go ahead and do a grow light setup. So once your plants have your first true leaves, you can move them to a larger pot, and then you can add some fertilizer to them. Not a lot, but you can add some. And then you can repot as the plant grows. Now, when the seed germinates, it actually has its own embryonic leaf that you're going to see first. But you want to wait until you get what's called the true, they call it the first true leaves. And that tells you that they're growing. And so once they get to be a certain height, you're going to want to take them out of these little original pots that you have and repot them into something bigger. And you can control, so you keep doing that, and people sometimes trim them and take some of the things off so they get fuller. So there's all sorts of things you can do while they're growing. Really, you're just biding time until the outside is ready for your transplant. So you may find, oh, they're growing really well, I'm not going to use a heating mat anymore, or I'm going to only use it a little bit. So there are ways when you grow them inside that you can have more control over when you plant them outside. So when they get larger, what you should start doing as you get closer to putting them outside is you should begin acclimating them, or it's also called hardening. So you begin to put them outside in their trays or their pots, whatever you have them in at that point. And you might start the first day with just an hour, and don't put them in the sun, put them in some shade. And so what you're doing is slowly you're increasing the amount of time that they're going to be outside. And you should do that before you transplant them. And you should make sure that when you do transplant them, that the nighttime temperature should be at least in the 50s, and that the soil temperature, the top 1 to 2 inches, should be in the 70s before you transplant your pepper plants to the outside. And then you follow the things that Rebecca said about staking them and watering them and feeding them and all those things. But you do need to give them a start inside in our area, because the growing season just wouldn't be long enough if you just threw your seeds out there in your garden. So are there any questions?
Haven't gotten any so far in the chat box, but we can give it a minute or two to see if more come in.
I had a hard time. I mean, we usually look for, you know, we always put EDU when we search things because it usually comes from the universities, or it does come from universities. And so we try to use information like that. But I had a hard time trying to find some. And Rebecca gave you in her presentation one of the presentations, one of the publications that I did find from Virginia Tech was the 426-413 publication, which she referenced in hers. So, but generally there's a lot of things out there with blogs and things, but as we all know, you have to be careful about those things and whether they really follow scientific, the best scientific information that comes from the state extension offices and master gardeners and things like that. But yeah, I found it very interesting because I've never started. I do usually start my herbs from seed. I have done that, but I've never started peppers. And I thought, my goodness, this is very involved here and much more involved than I expected it to be. And it's because of it requires a pretty long growing season, and that's why you need to do it.
I think one of the surprising things about growing peppers too is that we think tomato season and pepper season are synonymous, and they're really not. Peppers really come in end of August, beginning of September, as the tomatoes might be starting to wane. That's when you have that upsurgence of peppers, because not only are they warm weather plants, but they don't like it to be too hot because they'll drop their blossoms. And so it's like you have to get through that scorching heat, and then you have that like ridiculous influx of what am I going to do with all of these peppers? And so I always find that fascinating that it's, you know, it's in your head. It's like cilantro, tomatoes, and peppers are all supposed to be at the same time. Cilantro's in the spring and the fall. Tomatoes are high summer, and peppers are really the very end of summer. But somehow, you know, they become the iconic summer fruits.
Mm-hmm. Oh, one thing I didn't emphasize is their roots are really delicate. And so when you do move them from one pot, like you put 1 to 3 seeds into a single pot, and the idea would be you're left with the strongest and you get rid of the other ones. I did watch a video where they planted a seed in one corner and a seed in the diagonal corner, so they'd be further away. But clearly you want the strongest to survive, but you have to be careful when you take them out of the pot. I mean, the idea would be if you had one, you could just take that and put it in a bigger pot maybe, and then put more soil around it. You don't have to disturb it. So you do have to be careful as you move them up. So be careful with their roots. And it also said that if you really want a particular variety, you should plant at least 6 seeds of that variety, that hoping you might get one. So I don't know, you know, how well they'll come through. You might get some pots that you planted, you won't get any.
I have not found them to be that finicky. I wonder if it's dependent on specific varieties.
Yes, I think the hot ones are more finicky.
Yeah, working in the greenhouse on the farm, like we plant them in flats. You know, you just sprinkle them in, and then part of the process is actually separating those plants out. Mm-hmm. And you might get some loss, but I don't think that's impossible. And that's actually how I plant them at home, is I tend to do a couple of seeds per cell, and then I separate them out. And I don't get a lot of loss that way, but that's really interesting, because I wonder if I should, maybe they would thrive a little better if I planted them. You know, it's just the difference between farm planting and garden planting is it's a completely different world, but also you tend to just get into a routine. And so it's fascinating to hear like these new tidbits of information, and you're like, oh, I could be doing better. These could be even more robust. So this is really fun to hear.
Yeah, and some of the things, I guess, when you transplant, you can go more towards adding some potting soil and things like that. Mm-hmm. You can move it up as you go, and you want to give it some nutrients once you get it out, that initial starting one. Not a lot, but a weak one. And so, yeah, I found that as well to be interesting, how it does just fine in the beginning. Without any type of nutrients in there, because the seed has its own endosperm and takes care of that first leaves and when it germinates.
Okay,